Hi, everyone. Thanks again for coming. Last week, I know we had some technical issues. I hope that they're resolved this week. My name is Diego Benitez. I've been with Witness for Peace for over a year, going towards a year and a half now. And what I'd like to do today is just present to you some information concerning the presence of the U.S. military here, the expanded presence, and provide a framework for discussion. Colombia is an Andean nation located on the northwestern part of South America. It's the only country in South America with access to both oceans, the Atlantic to the north and Pacific to the west. Colombia has been fighting an internal conflict involving guerrillas, paramilitaries, and state forces for over 40 years, and unfortunately has one of the worst human rights records in the Western Hemisphere and the second highest internally displaced population in the world after Sudan. In the year 2000, the U.S. implemented a multi-billion-dollar strategy called Plan Colombia, an agreement developed under the Clinton administration to help Colombia resolve its internal drug crisis and focused heavily on drug interdiction and eradication. It was later expanded under the Bush administration to include aid in the fight against terrorism. Despite that aid, operations did little to stem cocaine production in Colombia and its export to the United States. Recent studies are quick to highlight the decrease in production between the last few years, as shown in this graph. But when compared to pre-Plan Colombia days, coca production has not decreased at all. As we can see in 2008, cocaine production levels are parallel to 10 years prior in 1998. Fumigations, forced eradication, interdiction, and over $7 billion U.S. tax dollars have not completed their goals. The U.S. has been involved in supporting coups and proxy governments from Cuba to Nicaragua, Honduras, and Chile, and it should come as no surprise to learn about further U.S. expansion in Colombia. In October of 2009, the United States and Colombia signed an agreement granting the U.S. access to 7 military installations throughout Colombia. These included 2 naval bases, 3 air bases, and 2 army bases for the stated purpose of gathering intelligence and supporting operations against drugs production and terrorism. The Defense Cooperation Agreement, as it's called, was conceived as a result of a loss of access to the Manta Air Base in Ecuador. The 10-year lease on that base was not renewed by the Ecuadorian government. I'd like to highlight the bases that are being used in Colombia. We have 2 military installations, 2 naval bases, and 3 air bases. The last one highlighted, Palanquero Air Base, is the country's principal air base. And I'd like to comment on that one. Is the most contentious of them all. Presently, the United States is investing $46 million in its renovation. The tarmac is over 10,000 feet long, and it will have the capacity to store over 100 planes in this region here. The length of the runway also allows for 3 C-17 planes to take off at once. The C-17 can hold up to 134 troops or has the capacity to store an M1 Abrams tank along with 50 troops. This aircraft's primary purpose of operation is for transport. Now, we don't expect tanks to be shipped throughout the region. This slide is shown to highlight its capacity for transport, yet it's clear that this plane can prove to be a real menace in the region. Much of the concern throughout the region relates to the use of this base as a launching pad to spy on neighboring countries. In fact, if you can all humor me for a moment, I'd like to show some radar planes that were used in operations during the military presence in Ecuador, in the Manta Air Base in Ecuador. I'll zoom in on this. This here is one of the AWACS, the Airborne Early Warning and Control System, radar planes that were used during operations in Manta, and that neighboring countries fear will be used to spy on them throughout the region. Concerning the C-17s. Now, these C-17s have a wide area of coverage and can reach, in fact, the entire continent, or almost the entire continent of South America, excluding the southern regions of Argentina, without the need for refueling. This clearly provides an enormous military potential. The United States had been eager to replace the base it lost in Manta, Ecuador in 2009. Current President Rafael Correa stated that he would rather, quote, cut off his arm than allow the United States to stay in Manta. The Ecuadorian government also later learned that the 2008 attack on a FARC base in Ecuadorian soil was facilitated by the United States with use of the Manta airfield. Ecuadorians were among those killed in the attack. Ecuador has since ceased diplomatic relations with Colombia. Undoubtedly, the presence of the United States military in the region directly affected bilateral relations between these two countries. The secrecy and ambiguity behind the Defense Cooperation Agreement contributed to a wave of backlash. Within the agreement, Colombia not only allows access to the bases for full-spectrum military operations, but the ambiguous language in the text also allows for the possibility of an expansion by the United States into civilian airports and other installations. This slide gives us an idea of what will be conducted under this agreement, including interoperability, joint procedures, logistics and equipment, training and instruction, intelligence exchanges, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, combined exercises, and other mutually agreed activities in order to address common threats to peace, stability, freedom, and democracy. Now, there's a lot to be questioned here. Joint procedures have not been described in this text. Training and instruction offers the dangerous opportunity for other countries in the region to receive training and for the potential relocation of institutions such as the School of the Americas, now known as the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, to operate in Colombia with immunity. Surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, this directly threatens the sovereignty of neighboring countries, keeping in mind the reach of the C-17 and surveillance aircrafts that will be operating in these bases. Other mutually agreed activities, well, these are conveniently left out of the text. And finally, peace, stability, freedom, and democracy. The U.S. brand of democracy is closely connected to its promotion of free markets. In a region of the world where this ideology is being rejected at a growing pace, it begs to ask, what does the United States consider a common threat to peace, stability, freedom, and democracy? Well, it just so happens that a document released by the Air Force in mid-2009 sheds some light on what this threat may be. In this document, the Defense Cooperation Agreement will allow for full-spectrum military operations in a critical sub-region of our hemisphere where security and stability is under constant threat from narcotics-funded terrorist insurgencies and anti-U.S. governments. There is no doubt that countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, and at times Ecuador have spoken negatively in public about U.S. economic and military activities in the region. These are the anti-U.S. governments that this agreement will affect most. And these are the governments that pose a threat to peace, stability, freedom, democracy, and I'll go ahead and add free market principles to that list. The ambiguity of the text here is that under the agreement, Colombia will be allowing access to and use of other facilities and locations as may be agreed by the parties or their executive agents. This paragraph contributes to the fear that U.S. presence may increase throughout the country, and nothing is clear on where these other locations may be. It's important to know that we're not just talking about military personnel, but also contractors. Presently, the legal cap is set at 800 military personnel and 600 contractors. Some of these contractors include corporations you all may have heard of, including Lockheed Martin, DynCorp, Northrop Grumman, and AirScan, to name a few. Now, AirScan is an operator of manned and unmanned aerial vehicles, and it's worthwhile mentioning because in December 13th of 1998, AirScan misidentified the village of Santo Domingo in Arauca, Colombia, as a hostile guerrilla target, leading to a cluster bomb attack by the Colombian Air Force, where 18 civilians, including 9 children, were killed. The operation had been planned at an Occidental petroleum complex. Occidental Petroleum is one of the largest oil and gas companies in the United States. And this provides evidence of the cooperation and support between large multinational corporations and the United States military abroad. The greatest concern to many in Colombia is that Colombia shall grant the United States personnel and their dependents the privileges, exemptions, and immunities accorded to the administrative and technical staff of a diplomatic mission. This is one of the most contentious issues within the framework of this agreement. In August of 2006, in an air base in Melgar, Colombia, site of one of the bases the United States has granted expanded access to under this agreement, Sergeant Michael Cohen and military contract employee Cesar Ruiz were accused of raping and molesting a 12-year-old girl. They were later extradited to the United States, where the court system has yet to share the rulings on these men. The family of the victim argues that this grants them impunity and violates Colombian law. In fact, throughout the world where there is U.S. military presence, there are cases of violent sexual acts against nationals of that host country. For most South Korea and Iraq. And let's not forget about the infamous Abu Ghraib prison scandal. The United States plans on expanding its presence and operating with immunity in a country that the State Department's 2009 Human Rights Report states suffers from, quote, unlawful and extrajudicial killings, military collaboration with paramilitary members, forced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, illegal surveillance of civilian groups, corruption, and harassment of human rights groups and activists, among many others. With the worst human rights violations in the hemisphere, with over 4 million internally displaced persons, and over 2,000 extrajudicial killings have been committed by state authorities within the past 10 years. The Plan Colombia strategy has failed to achieve its goals, and there's no reason to believe that a military expansion will do any better. A meeting of the Union of South American Nations was held in Ecuador, where heads of state from Latin American countries had dialogues in response to this agreement. Ecuador had argued that access to the bases and the airfields will provide a disproportionate response to counter illegal armed actors and narco-trafficking. In addition, they argued that the bases will not be under Colombian control and that it would be an extraordinary move to allow the United States military to receive orders from a foreign command. In response to such a heavy and expanded presence of the U.S. military, Venezuela has positioned itself defensively. Hugo Chavez has stated publicly that, quote, we must prepare for war. What has raised eyebrows in the region is that Venezuela has been purchasing an alarming amount of military hardware from Russia, including fourth-generation fighter jets. It's contributed to fears of an arms race in the region. In addition, the United States Geological Survey released a study in January of this year stating that Venezuela has the largest oil accumulation it has ever evaluated, with over 500 billion barrels of recoverable crude oil. Considering that the argument that oil was an instigator for the war in Iraq, Venezuela's fears of U.S. military intervention are not so unfounded. Brazil is also concerned about U.S. presence in the region. It shares an extensive border with Colombia in the Amazon, where there is a wealth of untouched natural resources. surveillance by U.S. planes would be a breach of their sovereign airspace. In fact, most of Latin American nations have expressed concern of an expanded U.S. military presence. In Colombia, there's been a series of large movements rejecting the expansion of the U.S. military. Among the concerns expressed include a fear of the loss of sovereignty and a fear of regional conflict that the U.S. presence may generate. A question has been raised concerning sovereignty and conflict. If the United States conducts activities outside of Colombian borders using Colombian bases, how will neighboring countries respond to the transnational aggression? Will Colombia become a target for actions that the U.S. conducted using Colombian bases, or will its neighbors respect its sovereignty? We don't know, and we hope we never have to. When commenting on the agreement, Colombian indigenous leaders, social organizations, and NGOs expressed various concerns. Among them, they state, "We know that the arms business is big and that wars are extremely profitable. The U.S. military will be used to support the interests of their multinationals who exploit and rob our natural resources." Jose Goyes, indigenous leader and former governor of the Honduras Reserve. These bases are a continuing process to impact the removal of leaders in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Honduras. U.S. military aid will continue to harm the thousands of victims of indiscriminate fumigations in Colombia. Ivan Cepeda, newly elected House Representative. This is not, quote, an extension of previous agreements, as our government says. This agreement allows for the exchange of foreign troops and is a violation of our sovereignty. It is unconstitutional. Gustavo Gallon, Colombian Commission of Jurists. In fact, the agreement is currently under review since its constitutionality is in question, and they are still waiting for a ruling. A No Bases coalition was formed in response to the agreement. The movement is learning from the experiences of successful movements in Ecuador, Panama, and Puerto Rico. More information on them can be found at www.colombia.no. Also, I'd like to add that Witness for Peace was present on April 8th during a hearing in Congress and voiced its concerns about U.S. military expansion in Colombia. In defense of the agreement, President Obama stated, quote, "We have had a security agreement with Colombia for many years now. We have updated that agreement. We have no intent in establishing a U.S. military base in Colombia." He went on to say, "This is a continuation of assistance that we had been providing them. We have no intention of sending large numbers of additional troops into Colombia, and we have every interest in seeing Colombia and its neighbors operate peacefully." Colombian President Álvaro Uribe echoes the remarks of President Obama and states that Colombia will remain in full control of its bases. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, quote, "The United States does not have and does not seek bases inside Colombia." The State Department released a fact sheet in defense of the agreement, yet the ambiguous language leaves the door open for more expansion into Colombia. And let's not forget the Air Force document that stated this agreement will target anti-U.S. governments. And we've already mentioned who those countries are. Governments in Latin America have been slowly leaning towards the political left and have at times rejected what has been coined as neoliberalism, which refers to U.S. free market principles. The U.S. interference in Latin America went well into the 20th century, and there's no reason to believe that it will be any different throughout the 21st century. There have been concerns recently about the U.S. Defense Cooperation Agreement with Brazil. It's been reported in several outlets that access to the bases in Brazil would resemble an interagency task force already in operation in bases in Lisbon, Portugal, and Key West, Florida. Many feel that this is not only a further threatening sign of U.S. presence in Latin America, but also that it helps to justify U.S. presence in Colombia. Because if there's a presence in Brazil, the regional powerhouse, then what's the big deal with one in Colombia? What it comes down to is that the defense contract agreement is viewed as an expansionist attempt that builds upon the failures of Plan Colombia, offers security guarantees for U.S. corporations in the region, works towards passage of the heavily debated free trade agreement, and stamps the U.S. presence on the continent for the next decade. Colonialism is marked by the presence of a foreign power, the loss of sovereignty, the manipulation of the social, economic, and governing system of the indigenous population. There's a set of unequal relationships that makes this control possible, and it's all done for profit and power. How much different is that than what is happening in Colombia today? Thank you all for listening. And finally, I'd like to mention that currently Witness for Peace will be running a delegation July 24th through August 2nd that focuses on the U.S. military presence and military bases. For more information, please contact Ken Crowley and Leslie Gill, whose information is located at the bottom of the screen. Thank you all again.